evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Wednesday Night Photo Show. My name is Scott. I'm the main photo instructor here at Dan's. And with us again tonight, we have a familiar face. Phil Voistock is with us. Why don't you say hi?
Hi, everybody. Hello, hello. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. How have you been?
Doing great. Doing great.
It's good.
The weather is ripe for photography, so I'm happy about that. Had some nice days for photography, and I'm excited about that. Spring is here. Summer's on the way. It's picture taking time.
Yeah. Did you get out at all today? The weather was fantastic. I went out for a walk at lunch.
Yeah, I went out a little bit at lunch and didn't want to come back. It was nice.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. So we've got a bunch of people joining us tonight. Thank you very much. Remember, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, any of that kind of thing, please feel free to throw a comment in the chat, in the comments, and that kind of stuff. We'll be able to throw those up on the screen. We'll be able to answer questions live. So this is always a good time as you're joining us, and you can throw some stuff in there. So tonight was all about street photography. We've had a couple of people asking about street photography, and so this is a fun one that we wanted to touch on. And I know that, Phil, you've done a bunch of this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Probably over the last 20-ish years, about 20 years or more of really having a lot of fun with it. Sporadic here and there, not something I do all the time, but it's one of my favorite types of photography when I can do it.
Yeah. And so when this came up, everybody was like, okay, who do we have on for street photography? Yeah, let's have Phil.
Yeah, we've got a lot of folks here actually that dabble in it, and I've played around with both black and white and color street photography. I know some people sway towards one or the other, but I'll show a couple of those images when we get to mine. But yeah, it's been fun, and whenever I get a chance to do it, I'm out there doing it.
Yeah, and it's been, kind of the same for me. Like, it's one of those things that I always, no matter what other kind of stuff I do, it's one of those things that's just always in the back of my head. Whenever I'm out wandering around someplace, I've usually got a camera with me, and I'm kind of always like viewfindering, right? Like looking around for what's going to make a picture.
Yeah, I find myself doing that even without the camera, right? You do that too.
Yeah.
You see the shot, you happen to be in the city, or it doesn't even have to be a city, of course. We'll talk a little bit about that and where the places are that you can do this kind of thing. But it doesn't even really have to be somewhere where you have your camera at the moment, but you see that shot and you kind of frame it in your mind and you say, boy, I wish I had that camera. So that's why we have to have it with us all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. So I guess to start this off, we can kind of take a stab at trying to define what the heck street photography is anyway. It's a word that it's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot. There's a lot of people talk about street photography, but I don't know that, like, it conjures a very specific sort of image, but to me, street photography might be a little broader than that. So, what are your thoughts?
It is kind of a loose genre, if you want to kind of think of it that way. Some people have their own mind about it and look at it very strictly with, I do mostly this kind of thing, that's my thing, and that's what I see as street photography. But it's kind of a hard one to nail down. It's a little easier to quantify what sports photography is, right? But, one of the ways we think about it is usually along the lines of doing some kind of candid photography in some public space. That's what a lot of people will agree as at least a starting point for this. It's not necessarily something that is a posed portrait in most people's minds, although some people for street photography do a fair amount of what would be called an environmental portrait. Somebody on the street, a shopkeeper, a street performer, any number of people like that. So there's that kind of thing. But mostly we're talking about some kind of candid photography. Often it's people, but it doesn't have to be, right? It could be some other thing. It could be just the human element, right? Just some item or artifact of a person, like a shoe, or, you see things like a glove on the ground and that kind of thing. If it's in the right light, with the right background and the right context, some people might consider that a street photograph. And there are some pretty neat things out there like that. So it doesn't always have to be a person per se. Right. Depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
How about you? What do you think it is?
It's a good question, right? Like, I'm usually thinking about it if I'm walking around on a city street someplace, right? So, like, to me, if I'm thinking about it as street photography, I'm usually thinking of an urban environment, but maybe not necessarily, I guess. Like it is pretty, like you said, I guess it's pretty loose. And also like this past year has been like one of my favorite things about street photography is kind of being in this chaotic crowd of swirling stuff. And like this past year, I have not done that at all. So I've been photographing things like out in the street and have a suggestion of the presence of people without any actual people in the shot. And that's still kind of street photography to me.
It's kind of like a potential street scene, right? Or a street photography scene, something like that, right? Yeah, well,
like
in terms of
almost
what
notable
you're saying,
for the lack of people.
Yeah, in terms of what you were saying about the places, you know, some of the things that I do whenever I get a chance are things like street fairs. I mean, it's not a city per se. I mean, county fairs, that kind of thing. Those are some of the places. Yeah, farmers markets, county fairs, that kind of thing. Even the beach, right? Whether you're there with your family or not. I mean, there's a lot of street photography in and around the beach areas. So there's a lot of places that might fall under this umbrella of street photography, depending on how strict of a definition you want to give it for the kind of things you do.
Right. And got a good question here. Is there a digital camera available in the market that you can do waist level shooting as with a twin lens reflex camera? And that's a great question. So if you are, for those of us who are not old as the hills and might not remember twin lens reflex cameras, I'm going to throw a quick picture up here. This is Vivian Mayer, pretty well-known street photographer. And what she's using right there is a twin lens reflex camera. There's two little lenses, and you shoot by looking down into the viewfinder. So, yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that, so I'll let you take this one. What do you think of?
No, that's okay. I mean, the kinds of things that people are doing with some of the modern cameras right now, since many of the digital cameras have either a partially articulating LCD screen that allows you to flip and look down into it, or it's fully articulated. It'll kind of flip out to the side and you can look down into it. You know, I can actually show you that now. I can give you an idea,
like I take this and I can flip it out that way. Right.
Yeah, this is the side. This is the side of the camera here. I could be looking down on this screen as the camera is pointing outward, and I can approximate what he's talking about with the twin reflex camera. So shooting from the hip is something that I do occasionally. I don't do it a lot. I think I have at least one or two images in there where I'll show you where I did that. But this kind of camera, or any kind of camera where the screen articulates, allows you to do that kind of thing. It's not quite the same look as the twin reflex, but it'll do the same thing.
But yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I find myself doing that. Like just that little difference in perspective, just getting it down to waist level changes the way you see the scene.
Yeah. You bet. Thanks for the question.
Oh, interesting. Try Mint. They make an instant camera that uses Fuji minis, so you can do the waist level and be shooting the Fuji instant film. That's cool.
There's fun. That sounds like fun. Good deal.
All right. So, like, okay, we took a stab at defining street photography, but what is it that I guess kind of interests you and draws you to street photography? What is it that you think you find so interesting about it in the first place?
Good question. I'm trying to think back to when I really started to get involved with it. Twin reflex actually was the first camera that I started doing street photography with. Quite a long time ago. But more recently, you know, in the last 20 years or so, 15 to 20 years, took a lot of day trips or sometimes weekend overnights in New York City and Philadelphia. You know, have some family in Philly. And in New York City, spent a lot of time there, got there a number of times throughout the year. And that kind of and I always had a camera with me for the most part. I like to shoot the architecture. I like to shoot a lot of different things in the city. And I'm familiar with a fair amount of the photographers from way back when, you know, not speaking of the contemporary ones that have been around for the last couple of decades, but going way back to the Cartier-Bressons and those kind of folks. But I've always had an interest in that. And just being in that environment and seeing that chaos that you were talking about and being kind of amongst that, And when you stand still for a moment, if you happen to stand still because you're looking for directions or something, and that mass of people of all different types and sizes and all different emotions and speeds, when that comes walking at you and you have a camera in your hand, it's almost irresistible. It's almost irresistible for me anyway to pick up that camera and find something interesting, whether it's a color or an expression or a hairdo or a hat. It's almost irresistible to not hit that shutter. I had to do it. So I started it and tried it a few times and failed at it miserably, like most things when we try it for the first time. But it gets a lot more fun the more often you do it. So that was my story. I get a lot of time in the city, so do that for a tourist or go in for a specific reason for a specific event, and the camera's there, and you pick it up and you start shooting. And then you get a little more structured with it. You try to get a little more precise.
It's kind of funny that you say that. Like, I think my first forays into what you might call street photography came for me when in college, and we would our art department and our music department would take yearly trips into the city, New York City. I guess I should specify.
We kind of say that, don't we? The city, right?
Right, the city, despite the fact that Philadelphia is an equal distance the other way.
Exactly.
But and I found myself, and I just ahead of this kind of went and dug through some of my old pictures from college.
Oh, terrific.
And even, like, these are work prints that still have some of my notes on them for, like, okay, dodge this, burn that. But, like, I don't think I even realized there was a thing called street photography when I started going out and taking pictures. And, like, it was the exact same thing. Like, when you're confronted with that sort of a scene on the street, you're just, like, I was just fascinated with all that stuff. And it was just, I don't know, something about it just jumped out to me, and I just started doing that.
Great.
And
did you start with simpler compositions, or did you find that you were trying to fit a lot of things in the frame, or how did it start off for you when you first got into it?
Like, this was, I guess I kind of started off simply, right? Like an element, right? This was kind of a simple composition. This was blind, dumb luck. This was actually, like, after we had all gotten on the bus to go home and then shot out the window at, like, the horse and carriage and the hotel and all that stuff.
It's kind of a complex composition, though.
That one's kind of a complex composition. I feel like I got lucky with that one. And later, when I think we're going to talk about, like, influences, seeing some modern photographers, specifically a guy named Alex Webb, has really pushed me in the past couple years to try getting more complex with composition.
Yeah, the composition can be a big part of the whole thing, and it can be a challenge because of the chaos, right? You're trying to rein in that chaos, and you're trying to make some sense of it and find something interesting. But I think a way to start for people who haven't tried this is to start simply. Find that one person or that one element and see how it works.
Yeah. Oh, John's got a good question. The recent increase in privacy, and we had I think we had another question similar to this one. With recent increase in privacy awareness issues, do you see changes affecting your craft? Wow. Good question.
Yeah, a good one. And it's a hard one to pin down, but it's something that a lot of people are thinking about. A lot of photographers are thinking about. We're not photography lawyers, and we don't play them on YouTube, so we can't go by everything we say as the gospel. But you still have the right to shoot in public places. It's a matter of if you do ever get confronted with someone, along those lines, and they ask you, not to take the photo, or did you take the photo or delete? It's up to you to how to handle it. But usually you just want to acquiesce to whatever their wish is. It's not worth. No single image is usually worth any kind of risk like that if somebody's unhappy.
Yeah, and even, like, I'm not out there to make other people uncomfortable. I'm not trying to kind of...
Exactly.
I mean, there are photographers who work that way. Like Bruce Gilden is a very aggressive street photographer who gets right up in people's faces, and that is absolutely not... I'm way too small to get away with that.
The neat thing about it is you can be somewhat passive about it and wait for the action to come to you and be just as successful. And then there are those people like Bruce who go after it. And it's not only seeing something that they want over here and wanting to get the shot of that, but the proximity at which they take themselves is really right in people's faces. And that works for him, and that works for a lot of people. And for other people, it just doesn't work that way. The good news is you can be as passive or going after it kind of thing as you want to, whatever you're comfortable with. But as far as the other privacy concerns, I think you have to deal with when you're in the street anyway, or when you're actually shooting, people, whatever their wishes are, I usually try to cater to that. And I don't really try to take any pictures that put people in a bad light. I mean, that's subjective, of course. I'm never trying to do that. Yeah, like you said, Scott, you're not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. As far as posting those images, if you do choose to post them, if someone's in a public space, we typically have the right to take that photograph. Now, things may vary from state to state and that kind of thing, so you have to be careful and do your research, but we can still shoot in public places as long as the public.
You're in public and they're in public, and there's no, I guess the term is no reasonable expectation of privacy when you're out on a public street.
Exactly.
All right. So I think you raised an interesting point when you started talking about like active versus passive, how close are you to the subject? Sure. And some of that starts to get into kind of what sort of gear are you taking when you go out there? Like, how do you think about what you're going to choose for street photography?
I get a lot of questions about that. I shoot everything from a digital SLR, which is a bigger camera than some of the newer mirrorless cameras. So I shoot everything from a digital SLR with a relatively small lens. There's no big telephoto lenses I'm typically using for this stuff, to a mirrorless camera, again, with a relatively small lens, right down to a smartphone. Sometimes that's what I have with me, and that's where the shot is. So, so I'll do it. But as far as the cameras go, usually for the photographers out there who are shooting with mirrorless or digital, for me, I mean, I've shot as wide as 14 millimeter on a crop sensor camera, and that's about 21 millimeters in terms of the perspective. But usually, if we talk about equivalents for a full frame camera, if we can do that, I'm usually shooting anywhere from 20 to 70 at most, for that kind of thing. But it's usually wider angle. Of course, wider angle requires you to get in closer to kind of fill the frame. But this is a 35 millimeter, right? So if I had this on a, let's call it an entry level or a intermediate level digital SLR with a crop sensor, that's going to be acting about 1.5 times that. So it's going to be closer to the 50, 60 range. And that's good for most people. How about you? What lens or lenses do you usually shoot with?
I started out on this thing, right? Like, this is the camera that got me through college.
Nice.
With the old 50 millimeter f1.8. And for the longest time, that was always my go-to. Yeah. When I got myself a digital SLR, it was a D90. And I felt like this is not a huge camera. It's an APS-C. But it still felt substantially bigger than this.
Sure.
Right. But this is the 35 millimeter f1.8. So again, that 50 millimeter ish sort of perspective, right?
Here's a 50 that's off the camera with the hood on. So the actual lens itself is pretty small and unassuming, you know, but 50 millimeter 1.4, which is another favorite of mine. And, things like the 50 millimeter 1.8 is a relatively inexpensive lens for just about any system compared to some of the others. So that's why it's a lot of go-to for people for a first lens.
Yeah, nice and compact. And I'm looking for, this is my weird thing. I know I'm a little obsessive about traveling light. But when I was looking for something else, like I wanted some other camera and I wanted something else that would be small and compact to have with me like 100% of the time, because that thing about the best camera is the one you've got with you. So if that happens to be your phone, then that's what you got. But I got tired of that being the one I had with me. So I went and I got myself this thing, which is a Fujifilm X100s. I've had this for like 8 years now. And if anybody has seen me around the store, I've usually got this on my shoulder when I go out for walks at lunch. If I'm out just wandering around, I've almost always got this little thing with me. And now I've got down to something that's kind of in that ballpark or smaller. There was an interesting thing that happened, though. I had a couple weeks of buyer's remorse with this guy because it is a 23 millimeter f2 lens. And for the longest time, I'd shot with the 50 millimeter. Going to something that's more like a 35 millimeter equivalent.
Yeah,
was shocking. I've always been obsessed with rangefinders and Leicas and like that kind of stuff. And so this was like, this feels like a great fit for me. Oh my God, I got to get closer to people now.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to kind of get used to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It took me some time to get used to that lens that's on there.
Yeah, so people really have to think about that if they're looking to get a lens specifically for this or use one of the lenses they already have. Some people like to use a zoom at first if they happen to have one that's not too big because it gives them some flexibility. But for most people, anywhere from the 20 to the 70 range, anywhere in there, that equivalent works well for a lot of street situations that most people want to do. Keep in mind, the wider you are, the closer in you have to fill that frame without everything seeming really tiny in the final image.
That's when I started putting the Robert Capa quote at the bottom of my email. If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough.
Close enough, sure. Sure.
And that's another thing that I've noticed in my practice of like getting out there and practicing and doing this is I kind of take that two ways. Like not just a physical closeness, but a presence in the scene, right? Like I'm almost thinking about it not in terms of I need to be 3 feet closer, but I need to like hear what's going on around me and like listen. And so, like I kind of want to engage all my senses and kind of be present in that moment and like have an almost emotional closeness to the subject.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think Joel Meyerowitz, who's one of the folks that inspired me, street photographer. Some people might know him. He ended up being one of the few people that got inside 9/11 when that happened and did some very large format images in there. But did a lot of street photography for many years. The way he describes it, and paraphrasing, but he kind of looks at street photography as more of kind of along the lines of what you're saying, Scott. Not just taking a picture and making it a pretty picture or a nice composition, but having an experience with it, right? Because you do have this emotion, these people, this usually a chaotic scene if it's a busy city all around you, and being able to hear, like, as you said, what's going on around you, know if somebody's coming up behind you and see if the light's changing in front of you. All of that kind of stuff for me, when I look at certain images, even years later, I mean, I'm taken right back to that moment. And that is a real joy. Like when you can snap an image and you can be reminded of the sounds and the smells and what you felt at that moment, even years later. For me, that's part of the fun. That's part of the fun of street photography. People wonder why we do this, right? You kind of got to that to be like, why do you do this kind of thing? Like, why jump into it if it's kind of unusual? But that's one of the things that draws me to it.
So, all right. So what's your, I guess well, there's two places to go from there. And I guess we could start with like, what's your process look like? What are you looking for out there? Like, what is I'm going to grab my camera. I'm going to go out.
Sure. We're going. And what are we looking for?
Yeah.
The first thing for me is that, and this has been proven to me dozens and dozens of times over, whatever I have in mind, it's always something different, right? There's always some unusual thing that's going to throw that plan out the window. But looking at it in a positive way, I go into it being entirely open as to what might unfold in front of me. And by that, I mean, I might be taking a picture of, I might find an image of patterns that really work for me. There's a pattern in a woman's hat, and there's a pattern in the pants of the gentleman who just randomly happens to be walking next to her, and boom, those things are a nice connection, and I snap the image. I mean, things like that. But you just don't know what's going to come your way. So you have to be open to, I think, whatever comes your way. But if you go out without any strategy at all, and you haven't done this much before, much in the past, you're probably going to feel like you're floundering. So there's a lot of cliche street photography things. I mean, some people might look at it that way as a cliche thing to go after, like, certain complementary colors, or the pattern thing that I mentioned, or, finding a funny billboard and waiting for a person to walk by in just the right moment so the picture works with them and that kind of stuff. But I would encourage people, regardless of what they've seen other people do, if you haven't tried those shots, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. We're all on a journey with this, Scott, right? I mean, and we're all different parts of that journey. Some people have been doing this for a few months or a few years, and other people have been doing this kind of photography for a decade or more. So there's nothing wrong with trying something or be inspired by something that you've seen someone else do, even if it's kind of repetition. Certainly you don't want to follow that all the time. You want to be inspired rather than copy. But I would encourage people to be open to just about anything that comes in front of you, be aware of your surroundings. And when something grabs me, that's when I snap the picture. And it's different for everybody, right? All of the sum of my parts, my experiences and the places I've been in the world or not been and all that kind of stuff, that when a scene is in front of me that grabs me, it's the sum of all of those thoughts that I might have in the back of my mind. And for somebody else with different experiences, it's different. There might be someone,
like a different thing is going to resonate with you, right?
That's right. That's right. There might be a different kind of person, for instance, that attracts you, or a facial expression, right? Some people might be drawn to people who seem to be enjoying themselves on the street and they got smiles on their faces. Other people might be perfectly fine if somebody looks serious or if they have some other emotion across their face or in their gestures. It's a matter of what attracts you. So I'm open to just about anything. I do try to write a couple of notes down. I do this, and this is something I encourage everybody to do. If you know where you're going, obviously, look at what the light is going to be in that area, right? Where's the angle of the light going to be on the streets that you are going to be at, or part of the beach or the fair or wherever you are. So look at the lighting. I'll do that. Obviously, the weather is something to be prepared for, so you get prepared for that. And I think about what gear I want to take with me, and I go from there. So those are just a few things I think you definitely want to think about ahead of time.
And you mentioned to me that, I guess you, well, here, why don't we throw some of your pictures up there? You said you were out in the city and you came across people getting ready for a parade. Was that sort of a planned thing, or did you know that was happening, or did you just happen to come across that?
Well, that's a good example of being surprised by what you have in store. This image and the few next ones that I'll show you, I was in New York City, left my hotel early in the morning, left the family sleep in while I went out and took pictures early. And I said, I'm going to be heading out to Times Square because it was in walking distance. I thought that would be a good place to shoot again. Lo and behold, half a block from my hotel, there was the preparations for the Mexican Day Parade that day. And the parade wasn't started, but it was all the behind the scenes and the people getting started with things. And it was just this treasure trove of photographs. And the first one there, which I think you had on the splash screen, was one of the first ones that I grabbed. And this is a pretty wide angle lens. I'm very close to that gentleman with the tuber there. Then when you look at something like this one here, there's a whole lot going on in that scene. And what's interesting is you have a journalist in the main part in the center of the frame, and the person being interviewed took it upon himself to help by holding his tablet. And that gesture to me just said, snap the picture.
Yeah.
You don't always have the person being interviewed holding your tablet for you. So I just thought that was kind of funny. And then if you look in the background on the right, we have a kid that's crying. We have another gentleman with a hat, and there's so much going on there. And that's why I grabbed the picture. Here's another scene of some people here. If you notice, the people on the left and right are almost framing the person in the middle of the picture. That's a mask on the back of his head. That person is facing those folks.
Okay. Yep.
So there's a lot going on. And then when you explore the picture a little further, if you look closer, you'll see that the dark stuff outside of that backpack or whatever it is actually the person's hair. It's not part of that milieu. So there's so many things going on. Here's another gesture. We talk a lot about when do you snap the picture? I guess you get that question too, Scott. How do you know when to snap the picture? Sometimes it's a gesture. This one here is a good example of, I was looking at this scene, had the camera to my eye. There was a little bit of movement, wasn't sure what was going to happen next. And then this person's arm came out of nowhere on the right side and is handing this piece of fruit to this person who's smiling. So it was that moment right before they grabbed it that seemed to make the most sense.
Right. That gesture, that connection between the people in your picture. Yeah, that's great.
Here's one where it wasn't, it was a family who was posing for someone else at the time. I raised my camera up just to kind of get permission to see if they would allow me to take the picture. And one of them nodded. And so while they were getting their picture taken by someone else, I snapped it. It just really grabbed me. When you look at that boy in the center, the emotion on his face, it's pretty interesting stuff. Here's another person, another boy in the background. We used a little bit of reflection there, and the expression on his face is what drew me to take the picture of that one. You know, children are interesting. We get a lot of questions about that, going back to the privacy issue. For me, it's just about all the time I'm going to be asking permission if there's someone around who is a parent or an authority figure looking person next to that child for permission, and almost without fail, I'll be asking for that, as I did for a number of these images. This one was on a float, so that's where these little girls are, and just them looking ahead like this, and when they saw the camera, the expression on their faces is what said, "Snap the picture."
Bill says, "Good intuition." I guess intuition is part of it, but I find like intuition is a thing that comes with practice.
It is, but I do suggest folks trust their intuition, because this stuff happens fast. This stuff happens really fast. And following your gut is going to get you the shot more often than missing it. You know, if you stop to think sometimes, it's going to be miss the shot.
Right.
Here's another one where I did get permission. Interesting about the story about this one is this wasn't Halloween. This is in New York. It wasn't anywhere near. It was nowhere near Halloween, but this little boy with very long hair in the Batman suit was with his mother, and asked her permission, and she said perfectly fine, yeah. And the kid wasn't even looking at me, and he turned around almost like splaying the cape, and he fell into that reflection in the window, and you got to be ready and snap, and there you go.
Oh, that's great.
Kid just wanted to wear that Batman uniform all day.
Just really wanted to be Batman that day.
All day long, and by golly, he was. I'll show you one more. Here's an example of one in a park. You know, this is within a city, but just a quick nod of the camera or a gesture of the camera to the person who was playing the accordion there, and he nodded that it was okay to take the picture, and I snapped away. The light falling on her and on the accordion. I mean, that's what had me fall in love with the scene.
Yeah. I think I've got some similar, like, if we look at something like this one, this was at the Halloween parade in Bethlehem. And I kind of like this one because you've got these, like, there's three little kids in police officer costumes with this guy here in the middle.
That's fantastic.
Who is directing traffic. Well, it turns out that, like, mom was just out of frame on the other side. Those are his kids. Like, I got into a conversation with her about this, and they were like, they hit the Halloween store like 2 days after everything went on clearance. Like, okay, everybody's getting police officer costumes, and we're going to go hang out with dad at the parade.
Yeah. I like how you filled the frame with just all kinds of stuff there. You've got some leading lines with the people in the band and the foreground subject. That's another thing to think about with any street photography. If you can, always, just like landscape photography, be looking for that foreground, middle ground, and background. You have something interesting in each area.
Yeah, I think there's another one from the parade here where there's a fair amount of like foreground, background stuff going on.
Oh, that dog looks like it's posing.
Right.
That's great.
I just kind of knelt down there because it was, somebody had done the thing with the black dog painted with the skeleton all over him.
Yeah.
And I just kind of got down at eye level with him. Here, I've got another Batman for you.
Oh, good. Well, go back to the other one quickly, if you could, Scott. I'll mention a concept here. People also, you asked, what do you shoot? What do you look for? Things like when people are looking towards one another, we have that kind of implied line of the gaze of one person to another. It's that kind of connection. Sometimes that works. Here we have the person in the background facing in one direction and the dog face kind of facing in the other. Sometimes that works. That mirror kind of effect works very well. If two different people, one has an arm going this way, another one has an arm going this way, same kind of effect. These are the kind of things that you just jump at and snap, whether you can get a perfect composition or not. You just grab it and you'll find out later if it really works for you. I just wanted to point that out.
Oh, good observation. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I guess this kind of leads to like Halloween parade stuff like that we talked about. That was, I call it like street photography on easy mode.
Yeah.
And for some of the people who had questions about privacy and concerns about being photographed,
Sure.
for me, one of the best things you could do is go to something like a Halloween parade where everybody is expecting to be photographed. They already got dressed up in a costume. They're going to be super happy if you take their picture, and you thought that their costume was interesting enough for you to lean in and take a photo.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to ease into this kind of photography. We started in the beginning, I mentioned that sometimes it's just a human element, right? It doesn't have to be people. That's one thought. I'll show you an image in a moment. Another way to think about it, if you're uncomfortable getting close to people, but you want to start including people in your photograph, is just start a little bit further back, right? Find an interesting foreground subject where a person is in the scene, but further back, and you don't feel like you're threatening them or vice versa. If you snap to my images, I will jump to, I can find one of them. Here's one here that some people wouldn't see as a street photograph. I mean, I shot it in the street, in the city. To me, it is a street photograph, but it tells a little bit of story.
Literally a street photograph.
Yeah, that's right. So it tells a story to me because, any of us who had been to a Burger King and had one of these crowns on their head or saw a little kid with them, that's exactly what you're looking at. And I don't caption a lot of my images, but the king is dead kind of came to mind here, that was kind of funny. But it wasn't just obviously the that object, but it was the light and the way the lines and trying to find an interesting composition with it.
Another way to look at and textures.
Yeah. Another way to look at it is if you're not pointing your camera directly at someone's face, sometimes you can get away with a shot. This was an intentional shot, playing around with interesting compositions where you're not including faces. I wasn't trying to avoid these people seeing me take the picture, but just playing around with the lines and the geometry.
Yeah, what neat geometry there.
Yeah, so it happened in a split second, but the man was walking up slowly, and it was the line behind him leading to him that caught my eye. But then coming into the scene came the bicycle, and I tried to look for the right balance and snap the picture. And for me, it works. Here's another quick example of, it's going to be hard to see on some screens, but of what some people might look at it as an architectural shot, but there is a person in that image way, way back at the counter.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly that person wasn't worried that I was taking their picture. This gives me another suggestion for people that if you do go back to different places at different times, this is the same building many, many years earlier, similar lighting, although different. And somebody at that counter again, not including the doors, and then somebody doing some weird gesture kind of going around the corner there, and just playing with lines, playing with geometry, and trying to come up with a good composition. I'll show you one more. Take a moment for people to find the person in the scene probably, but this is on the roof of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They have a lot of different installations there, and it's a great place to shoot. And there were a few people here at the time, and that was a big sculpture that was there, and that woman just kind of fit perfectly in that frame, so I went and snapped it. So that's just another thought for easing into street photography with either an element of humanity, or including people in the image, but perhaps just a little bit further away, and then work your way in and see how it goes from there.
Yeah. Another favorite of mine, I live right here in Bethlehem, so Music Fest is street photography, fish in a barrel time, right? Like there's a ton of people all the time.
Festivals are a great place for that kind of thing. Lots of people with cameras too, right? Shooting the live action. So you're not the only one there with a camera. That'll get people a lot more comfortable a lot quicker if they're not used to doing that.
You're in that kind of a situation, parades, fairs, that kind of stuff. If I quick grab a picture here, something like this is at Music Fest. He might have noticed me if it had been any other evening in Bethlehem, but I was not the only person on the street with him that night. Right?
Sure.
Just crowds of people. And all kinds of interesting stuff to take pictures of. And for the, again, sort of a further back perspective.
Yeah.
Right. something like that. And I've got a lot of reflections and stuff. And there's just a couple of people that, this is one of the things I think I've heard it referred to as fishing, where you'll kind of find the scene that you want to take a picture of and just hang out and wait a while for somebody to come by and kind of animate the scene. Like, okay, here's the whole scene, and then somebody walks into it.
Another complex composition here. I like the way the people in the middle are somewhat near the middle are framed by all the color, and they're almost monochromatic or less color, at least from what I'm seeing there on the screen. That's very interesting. I like that.
Ooh. Oh man, good question. How do you decide to shoot black and white versus color?
Super question.
John. What are your thoughts?
For me, I most often shoot in color. I sometimes will be shooting in color with black and white in mind. As you get used to it, you can get better at, in your mind's eye, seeing what an image is going to look like in black and white, even though you're not shooting in color. I like all the information I get with color, and I like the tools that I have on the computer to convert to black and white. So I can do a lot of a lot of things there. One of the reasons I don't often shoot in color first or by itself is I can't go back, right? I can go from color to black and white, but I can't easily go from black and white to color. Although there are times I will put my camera in monochromatic mode, and people should know that most of their cameras will do that. And you can shoot in black and white and see what you're going to be getting right away. When I'm doing black and white, it's more about
follow on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. To follow on that, very often I will set the camera for RAW plus JPEG and then set the camera for monochromatic. And then I've got the black and white JPEG, but I've also got the RAW file to go back and do that color conversion process. Excellent
idea. That way you get the best of both worlds. For me, though, choosing which one to do over the other, I mean, street photography in color, I think, is more challenging. There's just more information, right? Let's face it. There's a lot going on. It's harder to simplify the scene. So for some people, it might be easier to get started in black and white. But I don't think it's a bad idea to shoot both. I really do. I really think you should explore both. There are some images that I've shot in color that it wasn't until much later, months later, years later, I decided to try it in black and white. And I ended up liking, it simplified things. It got distracting elements that were brighter colors kind of out of the mix or out of the mind's eye. So,
yeah,
hard question to answer on that, but that's my take on it.
I think for me, a lot of the time, it really comes down to the subject and what the subject kind of wants, right? Like this picture is about color, 100%. Right, like this.
I love the color.
Like anything in black and white.
That's what kept my eye wandering around the scene, was all the color.
Right. A picture like this one, not really about color. This is about this interaction of this woman looking into the baby stroller and smiling at this other baby while pushing her baby around.
Sure.
And like this to me felt like a black and white photo. I guess, and I've been shooting a lot more color lately. I've kind of leaned away from black and white for a couple of reasons. I guess we can talk about some photographers that have kind of influenced me lately. But I don't know, sometimes I will just set and one of the things that I've done is kind of given myself the challenge to shoot JPEG only. So I feel like I'm kind of like, okay, I'm going to trapeze without a net here. And I'm going to take away that, because I found myself using RAW as a crutch sometimes. Like, I can go back and I can fix this in RAW.
Sure. We all do it to some level, I think.
Yeah. So as an exercise, I said, okay, not going to do it. And then trying to get better at black and white by saying, I'm going to shoot in black and white, and that's how it's going to be. And if I'm not happy with it, that's on me.
If you snap to mine for a second, I'll show you two quick other images, Scott. This one, for instance, this was also.
I love that one.
Thanks. This was in a museum. This was in the Museum of Modern Art. And this was exactly what Scott was referring to earlier, that a lot of people try early on, and you find a good background and you wait for something to come into the frame. And this happened to be, in the museum with family, and we were literally taking a rest at the time. Like, we weren't just sitting down for me to compose this image. We were tired, and this scene was in front of me, so it probably was about 15 minutes before this actually happened. The reason this is in black and white is it was almost monochromatic to begin with. If you saw the color image, you would realize that there wasn't anything that the color brought to it. So the line, the shape, the rhythm, all of that was because of the black and white. Here's a much more complex one that there's a lot going on with, and this one was also largely monochromatic, and it's a dark scene. It's a projection. There was a concert going on. This was between the bands and so forth. But what's going on here is you have these people in the foreground that are going about their world, and you had just this projection showing all kinds of art film kind of wild things on the screen, all kinds of neat stuff with some music going on in the background. And I'm looking at that, and then this person walks into the scene, and their back becomes the canvas for the middle part of the projection.
Oh, right, the projection. Yep.
Yeah, so you're seeing on that person's back the continuation of that. So none of this works in color. It just doesn't work in color. But as a complex kind of photograph, all the different layers, the shadow, and all of that, it's made for black and white in my mind. So that's I can better answer that question by showing you pictures, I think.
Yeah, that's another good one, right? Like that picture that I had up of like the woman looking at the baby in the other stroller.
Yeah.
It's at an intersection in the middle of the street, and we're under street lights. Like the color of the light is gross. There's nothing particularly pleasing about the color in there, right? And
Gotcha.
Black and white lets me just get rid of that, right? You can just chuck it.
Simplifies it all, sure.
Yeah. So when you're out there, let's talk a little bit about camera settings. Like, what are you doing? What's your approach look like in terms of how you're setting up your camera? Because one of the things you talked about was you want to be able to take that picture instantly, right? Like you see the thing, you want to take the picture,
Sure.
You want to follow your gut. That means that your camera's got to be set up so that you really don't have to think about it, right?
Yes. There's a lot that goes into that, and I think we can hit on a couple of fine points that will get folks on the right track if they're not used to doing this at all. The image that I have up there is one with a very wide depth of field, right? So in order for that woman, who's a key part of the frame, to be in focus or in acceptable focus, we want to be using an f-stop, right, for the people who are used to doing that kind of thing, and higher f number or a smaller aperture, if you will, in order to get more in focus front to back. It also helps that this was a very wide angle lens, okay, going back to the lens choice. So the wider your lens is, it's just physics, the more depth of field or the more in focus from the front to the back of the scene you're going to get. So wide angle helps. F-stop, if you're looking for a starting point for a lot of folks and a lot of cameras and a lot of lenses, for me, I would say start around F8 or F11. Those would be the two that I would play around with if you have no starting point. And that's going to get you a lot of depth of field if you want it. Some people will do what is called very selective focus, where they'll focus on just a person's face and the background will be entirely blurred out. That's fine. That's a whole other aspect. You're going to use a lower F number like F2.8, F1.8, those lower numbers. And you're going to hopefully have that person further away from the background so it blurs out a little. The key thing for me, though, if I could back up a little bit, is it's usually starting with shutter speed. Because if we're talking about moving action in the street, at a street fair, on the beach or whatever, if the people's movement is blurred and that's not what you're going for, the image is lost, okay? So I would say starting point, if you could be at least at 1/250th of a second or better, you're going to be in good shape with stopping a lot of natural action, people walking briskly on the street, moving gestures that are fairly fast. 500th or higher would be even better. So those are a couple of starting points that I would mention. How about focus? Do you get people asking you a lot about how you focus on street stuff, Scott? Because I do.
Yeah, that is a thing. And that you just reminded me of one of my favorite quotes of all time.
F8 and be there.
Was asked, F8 and be there.
Fantastic. Yep.
Yeah. Any of you who might not be familiar with Ouija, one of my favorites, sort of the original Nightcrawler. And just, but like this was a camera that had like, look at this camera. There's no autofocus, there's no auto shutter, there's no motor drive. You get one picture and then ka-chunk, change out the slide film on the back. So he was picking f8 because, okay, it's going to hold everything in focus. I'm going to take the picture. The most important thing is to be there to take the, right, exactly. Like f8, yes, f8 and be there. This
right,
guy
Jim.
is an original.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that I think kind of leads into what you were about to talk about with focus is, like
go ahead, Scott.
Got adequate depth of field. I can throw this in manual focus, and I don't have to worry about the camera hunting and looking for focus and focus on the thing and focus and recomposing and just pick it up and hit the shutter button.
Yeah, if you're afraid of manual focus, because a lot of street photographers do use manual focus, and some people scratch their heads and say, well, how can you do that? Well, they're using wide angle lenses, which favors what we're talking about here, more in focus front to back to begin with. And they're presetting the focus at a certain distance, say could be 4 or 5 feet away, but setting it 4 or 5 feet away. What's that?
Sort of a middle distance, like estimating this is where my stuff is gonna be, right?
But setting it at that distance, there's a fair amount that's always an acceptable focus behind that. So if you typically shoot subjects that are somewhere between 5 and 20, 25 feet away, a lot of wider angle lenses at f8 or at f11 are going to get you a pretty sharp image, provided your camera shake isn't too bad and your shutter speed is up. Like we said, your shutter speed is up where it should be.
Distance scales on lens, flashbulb guide numbers. Yeah.
Harkening to a lot of different other cameras, right?
Yeah. But that's one of the, like, on this little camera, I've got a distance scale on here. It's a mirrorless little camera, but there's a distance scale in the viewfinder that tells me, okay, at f8, I've got this much stuff in focus. And I can kind of set it for in that general ballpark.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things when we're thinking about this, not just looking at your images on the screen, but when you're talking about camera settings and what you get out of that, and if you like it or you don't, you've got to print your pictures to really get a feel for what that's going to look like in a print. Seeing it on screen, we tend to pixel peep or zoom into 100%, and we say, oh, that looks grainy. Oh, that looks soft. That looks out of focus. But if you print it at 11 by 14 and look at it at a viewing distance of a few feet away, it looks fantastic, right? Yeah. So if that's your goal, is to have prints or to share with someone as a print and frame it and put it on a wall, before you start discounting your pictures and start deleting stuff, print some out. That reminds me of something, Scott, in terms of I do get questions about, well, do people ask you what you're doing on the street, and how do you get past? Yeah,
so like when you want to approach somebody for a picture.
I mentioned the mothers and the fathers, and when the kids are around. But when I do ask permission, those times when I do ask permission, I do sometimes get questions like they look at you kind of sideways, like, "Who are you? You're the 50th person I saw today with a camera. Why should I let you take my picture?" One of the things that I like to do, I used to carry like a little album, with just like little 4x6s or 5x7. So I'd show them some of my work. Like if I wanted to do an environmental portrait of someone, I'm spending a few minutes of time with them. You want to build some trust. But we do these little flip book kind of things. These things are tiny. They'll fit in your back pocket. We do these here at Dan's, and it prints a picture on each page. Like I get a bunch of black and white ones in the front, and I'll show examples of the kind of pictures that I would shoot. And if it's a color image, or if it's an environmental portrait, I might show them the kind of shots that I take. And all of a sudden it lends a little bit of legitimacy to what you're doing. And you're not just another guy or a gal with a camera. So I like to do that. That's one of the things
that's
that
a great
have
idea.
that with me. It adds some credence to what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of starts a conversation with them, right? Like you can kind of flip through some pictures, and that's just a little thing that you can just stick in your camera bag or whatever. Yeah, and
right? These days we have one of these, right? We've got a phone everywhere we go, but you could be showing them anybody's pictures on this, right? most people don't go through the trouble to print somebody else's pictures on a little thing like this and pass them off as their own. But yeah, a lot of people will just use their phone to show them what they do. For some reason, people seem to react to prints and little things like that. So that's why I like to do that kind of thing.
Yeah. One thing that I've heard other photographers do, and I know we carry a bunch of the Instax, the Fuji instant print stuff.
Yeah.
And somebody was telling me that what they do is they keep the little printer thing in their camera bag, and then we'll take a picture of somebody. If you're doing that street portrait kind of a thing, after they've taken the picture, they beam it over to the printer and instant print a little print for them and give it to them as a gift.
Yeah.
Right there on the street.
That's
cool.
another thing. That is it brings me up to a great thought. If you do frequent places, right? If you live in the city where you're shooting, or if you go back to a certain restaurant or a place and you've taken pictures of a shopkeeper or something like that, always offer them a print, or offer them to email them if they want to give you email address, if they're good with that kind of thing, or give them your card. It's amazing what that means to people. If I can get to one of the color images,
I'll
show you. Snap over to my images
and just show you. Give somebody your card and say, "Here, I will email you a copy of this picture."
I'll show you a fun one that I took. If you pull that up.
Yep, you got it.
So there's this guy who was a juggler and a showman, and this was at one of those county fairs, right? So it turned out he was in the same place both years back to back that we were there. So I snapped this picture right at the moment where the bowling ball that he's juggling is right covering his face. So I knew we were going back, and sure enough, I looked at the roster and the folks that were going to be there. He was going to be there again. So I printed out a 5x7 of this. I handed it to him on the side, and I said, "Look, I got your best side." That made his whole day. He was laughing. He was laughing for minutes because he thought that was a great picture. It was self-effacing, for him, and he thought that was just awesome. That I remembered a year later to bring him a picture, and that was just fun stuff. It's amazing the reaction you get from people.
And you've got a ton of people pictures in here. You've got like a bunch more portrait-y stuff than I ever do.
I'll show a couple quick ones if you like. Here's a good example of another public space in Grand Central. That's a good New York City place to shoot. You can't really take tripods in there, but you can balance your camera on certain things to kind of approximate a tripod. Here's another good example. People ask me about the gear that they're using, and boy, is my gear enough? Or I don't know if I want to take this camera out. This is a shot talking about concepts. We're trying to give people ideas on how to get when do you shoot or what do you look for. If you look at this, between the dog, the person with the mohawk, the red mohawk, and the clown in the window, we've got a triangle going on there, right? The dog's looking at the person's looking at the clown, and believe it or not, it looks like the clown's looking back at them. So what drew me to this picture was the red of the mohawk and the red of the clown. That's what I saw at the scene. And then this person squatted down and looked to be looking right at it, and it was looking right back, and that was the moment. Well, this was a 3 megapixel shot that was shot back in around 2003. And this is one of my favorite images. This is one of my favorite street images just because of that weird connection that's going on.
Little interaction.
Yeah. And so it's not always about, the specific gear that you have. It's getting the most out of it and learning, more about it. I know you talk in the art of photography class, you talk about things that we do here, like line and shape and color and form and all texture and all that stuff. It still applies here. So a lot of the same concepts from other types of photography apply here. And when you just kind of use them to your advantage when you're in a street scene and think about that stuff, then it starts to be a little easier. Things seem to slow down for you a little bit, and you start to get those good compositions.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we talk about in art of photography and in some of the other classes is then going back and sort of like doing the analysis of your picture. Like, okay, this one works. Why does it work? What is it about this? Let me kind of dissect this and pull it apart and see what is it about this picture that I like, so that like you can kind of keep that in the back of your head the next time you're out.
Yeah, and it's the same concepts. It's just applying them to a different type of photography.
Just applying them faster.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a face that just jumps out at you that has you want to snap the picture. Here's one that's maybe a good reason to talk very quickly about patience. When you see a scene like this and you've got a lot of mist and smoke and steam and that kind of stuff going on, this is one of those slower scenes. This person wasn't moving very much, but I waited to the moment where the rope was clear, the face was clear, the shovel. Sometimes you can be patient because things slow down a little bit. So take your time.
We got a question. John asks, to the best of your knowledge, have either of you been the subject of another street photographer's composition? And if so, how did that feel?
I think I have.
Oh, yeah?
I have. Yep. It was a while ago. It was many years ago. And in fact, I know I have. And it didn't feel great for about a half a second. And then I realized he was doing exactly what I was doing about 10 minutes earlier. And I said, okay, you got me. Okay, you got me. Here's an example of that, actually. This was a scene that I saw developing. I was at the corner of this street. And this person is standing in a doorway, and then you can probably make it out pretty quickly there. It's not the person, it's just a mirror image of him. And I was framing up the shot, and I finally got it pretty much where I wanted it for this picture. And then I realized he was a photographer doing the same thing, just 10 feet in front of me. He was shooting this mirrored scene of the glass on this building. And the reason I know that, even in this picture, if you were to zoom in, you could just make out his lens just in front of him. And he turned around, saw me, what I was doing, and he smiled. So there was this kind of neat interaction that happened there. So talk about shooting other photographers. This is one where I was behind. I was in the better advantage, I think.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Sort of like, hey, a colleague, right? Like photographers, cool.
Exactly.
I think, I don't know if I have been, other than like my wife, who is also a photographer, and I know I wind up in her pictures. Sometimes to her chagrin, like, what the heck are you doing? You just walked right in front of me. But other than that, I don't know. I don't know that I have. How would I feel about it? I think it's kind of cool to run into other photographers when I'm out. So I think I would probably be kind of okay with it.
I think it's kind of hard, if you do like street photography, to be totally against being in somebody else's street photograph. I'd have a tough time squaring that with myself over time. I think it's not that I'd much prefer to be behind the lens, but I can't fault someone if they're going to take a street photo of me when I happen to be there. One of the other things, just real quick, that you can look for, there's a reflection there. Reflections are kind of fun. Sometimes there's layers. This person is standing in the street, but yet is a main part of the scene. There's one other black and white one I definitely wanted to show quickly. Yeah, this one here. This was down in Philadelphia, actually. What you're seeing there is the top part of the image is a poster or a photograph that's hanging in a storefront. And the older cars that you see in that scene kind of mirror the older cars down below. You know, people say, well, what grabs you, or what forces you to snap the shutter? Well, look at the sunglasses on her, and look at the sunglasses on the woman in the scene below. That's the moment I snapped the picture, was when she came in with similar sunglasses. But then when you take it further and you look at the patterns on her dress, and the beads, and the chandelier, and the necklace on the woman up, the actress up top.
Yeah.
All of this stuff just comes into play. And this is the fun that you have with reflections. And reflections almost require you to play with manual focus, guys. So if you want to have fun with manual focus, that's kind of the thing to play around with, is with reflections, because your camera in autofocus won't always focus on the plane of the scene in front of you that you want it to. So if you want to play with manual focus, do that in street scenes or windows, and you can find some really cool stuff that way.
Yeah. And like that becomes, I guess we kind of get into the composition of stuff, and it's that juxtaposition of like comparing two things to each other. Like if you can find something where there's that relationship between these two different things somewhere in the scene.
Yeah, it's
like you get into this.
Photography is a lot about those relationships, right? Of all the disparate things in the scene.
Yeah. Things that don't actually have a relationship in real life, we create that relationship when we stick them together in the frame.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes it could be the moment you're going to shoot is when things separate themselves from one another. Like if you ever take a silhouettes are fun to do in street photography and in nature and all kinds of things. Well, if things are all touching all the time, like if you have a flock of birds and all of them are touching, that's not quite as strong of a composition usually than if they're all separated. Same thing with people in a scene. Sometimes when people are overlapping, it could be interesting and fun, but a lot of times, and I think you showed it in one of your images before, the people just spread out just for a moment, and it's at that time of separation that when you snap, you have that feeling that that's when you should shoot. Sometimes it's when people come together from outside of a scene, and that's what attracts you, or that's what makes it interesting. So just another thought or something to latch onto for people, for what to look for out there, and things that you might respond to, that when this happens, shoot, ask the post-processing questions later. Just get the picture when you can. Yeah.
So I guess to wrap up, what I'd like to take a look at is, like, who do you kind of look at? Like, for me, one of the things that has helped develop my eye and helped develop my skill in street photography has been looking at other people's work, and what can I learn from that, and how does that kind of influence the way that I shoot. And there's some that you mentioned that I've been looking at forever, and then a couple of newer people. So I don't know if we can kind of take a look at maybe some of the people that you've found influential, and maybe some of the influences that we've got in some of the pictures that you've shown us. Yeah,
you mentioned Elliott Irwin earlier, I believe. And he's one of the people that I really like. Not in all of his images, but in many of them, he's got such a touch for bringing out a light humor and sometimes even more overt humor in things. Got a great eye, but boy, just he's got a sense for bringing the levity in an image, and knowing when to snap to get that through.
I think this one is one of my favorites for that little bit of humor from Elliott Irwin with the Pink Panther coming around the corner there.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
This interaction between the kid and the fish.
Sure.
Or this, like, the mannequin looking out at this woman, and they seem to be like looking back and forth at each other. But yeah, another also a favorite of mine specifically for that reason. Like this strange sort of relationship between these between the subjects here. He's got a lot of photos of dogs.
That's one of my favorites there. Yeah. Talk about being in the right place. He seems to put himself in the right place to be lucky. If street photography is about lucky, he puts himself in the place to be lucky, it seems. Yeah. I give him all the credit. I don't give it the credit to luck. I give him the credit for putting himself in that position. And that's just it. You're not going to get the shot unless you go out there and try it.
Right. The thing about the harder you work, the luckier you get.
Yep. Yeah, I think that certainly applies when it comes to this kind of photography.
One of mine recently has been a guy named Alex Webb, who's a Magnum photographer. And I think you can, like, I would hope that there might be some of his influence creeping into my pictures. One of the things that there was a question about black and white versus color. And seeing his work has kind of encouraged me to get more into doing more color work. And not just color, but like his deep, dark, saturated color. Where I don't think I had pushed myself that far in that direction before. But just to look at his stuff, he's got these great complex compositions that always have so much stuff going. They're so dense, but they hang together so well.
He's got a great eye for geometry too, and making the geometry of a scene. If the subjects don't fill this, the people in the scene don't fill it, he does so with the geometry background that they're set against. Yeah.
Right. Something like this one. Right? Yeah. There's people here, but then like all the lines and the way it ties everything together, and the layers of stuff going on in the picture. This guy's been a huge influence on me recently. I'm on a big Alex Webb kick. Like something like this one's one of my favorites. If we look at that guy, like that's just, there's so much going on, and it hangs together so well as a composition.
Yeah, and this is a good example of putting things at the edges of the frame, not just in the middle. The people in the periphery, the things in the periphery. Gets a little more advanced trying to do that. Joel Meyerowitz, who's one of my favorites, talks about that a fair amount. And at first you tend to center a lot of things, but when you can put things at the edge of the frame and play in that regard and still have it be interesting, you can really start to keep yourself interested, because it's not just center cut, right? It's a complex kind of thing. It's more advanced. It's tougher to compose. So like any type of photography, sports, nature, all that stuff, for a lifetime you can spend in one genre, right? Well, street photography, if you play around with composition, I think has a lifetime of opportunities for you.
Yeah, and I pulled him up on Google Images. This is one of my favorite things to do when somebody gives me a photographer to go look at. You can just, this is so much easier than, back in school when you'd have to go to the library and maybe have to get like, oh, Alex Webb, I can get that on interlibrary loan from Minnesota someplace.
How about that? It's hard to complain, isn't it? Right. We can't
Google
complain
Images,
about too
Joel
much
Meyerowitz.
these days.
There it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Andre Cortez is one of the more classic photographers back in Bresson's day that I like. He worked a lot in black and white, of course, and 35 millimeter largely. And his eye for geometry and picking out complex scenes and making them work, boy, just a real inspiration. And it holds up till today. The some of the photos. Yeah. And the compositions.
It's so interesting how, exactly. It's these compositions are, I don't know, fresh looking. Like,
yeah. That's one of his most famous images there, and that one still inspires me. There's just so much going on there, but he makes it all work with the lines.
Yeah. And I know that this is another favorite of yours.
Eggleston.
Mr. William Eggleston.
Oh, yes. And, he wouldn't call himself a street photographer, right? But a lot of people who look at his stuff would see it that way. And what's interesting about him is, I always wanted to know what his viewpoint of it. I think it was one of the documentaries about him when he was asked that question, what is it that you photograph? And, what is it that you're doing? And I think he said, life today. 2 words. I mean, that's how he put it. And when you look at a lot of his images, you can really place yourself in that sense of time. And you can place yourself at that moment in those places. And I thought, boy, what an easy answer for him, but a poignant one. Life today. That's how he referred to it, not street photography.
Yeah. And to look at some of these, I'm kind of reminded of, some of the stuff that I've been doing myself has been, like I said, like for the past year, I haven't been photographing, a ton of crowded street scenes because they haven't existed. But in terms
you've been
of
shooting scenes and that kind of thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Like there's still this was like the day after everything kind of shut down in Pennsylvania, and it was not real common to be able to sit down in the middle of Broad Street right on the yellow line and take a picture from ground level.
Yeah, but think about that, what you just said there. 20 years from now, you captured that moment, even though it's devoid of people. It is of the moment because of the very absence of them. So it's poignant in that way. I mean, like you said, it's not common for you to be able to do that on that street at that time, but yet here we were, and it was a great time to snap a photograph.
Yeah. Like there's nobody on the playground on a nice summer day. Like it was weird, but it was like, that's what was going on.
Eugene Adjet, I forget the pronunciation, but he was one from way back when, and there weren't a lot of people in his images. He was shooting in France a lot. A lot of people look at it as architectural photography, but other people look at it like it was a scene, a potential street scene, right? Where there may be people at any moment. It looked like the people were about to enter the scene at any time, and his compositions and knowing where to stand was just, he had an uncanny knack for that. And it's a different kind of street photography without a lot of people in it, but still beautiful, still absolutely beautiful stuff.
And I think that's kind of one of the things that like I found myself kind of falling into was this idea of like, there are people, you just can't see them.
That reminds me of Walker Evans.
That's kind of a weird way to put it, but well, that was the other thing was we were going on walks like all the time. Right. As like, okay, we're not going anywhere. We're not doing anything. We're just going to go for walks around the city. And rather than sticking to streets, we just kind of gravitated toward back alleys. And I don't know, compared to like the nicely manicured front lawn, it feels like the backside here is where like people actually live.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And
And
you
so there
captured a mood.
was,
I mean, the lights are
yeah,
there. You've captured a real moody scene with a lot of interesting lines, and yeah, that's interesting.
right. So I found myself gravitating toward like backyards or the backsides of houses, or, you know, again, not necessarily with people in it, but clearly people are present, just not just kind of at arm's length.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can play a lot with geometry, and you can play with light. The absence of people in the scene doesn't mean you can't still snap pictures that are in and around where people are.
Mm-hmm.
Midnight,
Yeah.
the midnight blue sky thing, and the blue hour is a favorite time of mine to shoot.
Yeah, blue
I don't
hour,
get to
like
do it
walking
often
around
enough.
the city at blue hour, always like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's so much of my stuff just because it always looks good. Just that time of day.
That's great right there, Scott. I really like that.
Right. And again, I don't know if I would have taken this picture a year ago before I started looking at Alex Webb and thinking about, okay, I can do dark, saturated color. Right?
That's
Same thing.
That's a good point right there. That some people say, well, I don't look at other photographers because I don't want to be influenced by them. I want to do my own thing. If you have any kind of self-control, I think it's a good idea to look at as many photographers as you want to, as you're interested in, because if anything, as you just described, it kind of gives you permission to maybe shoot something that you wouldn't otherwise shoot, right? If only because you saw somebody that didn't take a similar shot, but maybe it was an unusual composition, just as wacky as the one you were just thinking about. Maybe it wasn't the same, but it was unusual. Or maybe it was at a time of day that you normally wouldn't want to shoot, but you've seen 10 other excellent photographers shoot at that time of day. So even if it's a subconscious thing, it kind of gives you permission to do that. So be inspired by people. You don't have to copy them, but you can be inspired by knowing what came before you and the people that are doing the kind of photography that you're interested in. And I've learned a tremendous amount by looking at other street photographers.
Yeah. Like I've always been big into the geometry and the shape and the action and stuff that you get from people like Robert Frank or Cartier-Bresson. But I think it was only more recently that like, okay, what about light? What about atmosphere? And what about color and that kind of stuff? Then that was a newer thing for me.
Yeah. I like a lot of what you're shooting there too. That's good. Good stuff.
Oh, thanks.
Time well spent. In a crazy year.
Yeah. Yeah. So like now I'm kind of thinking about what am I going to do with all this stuff? Because this is a kind of thing that kind of turned into a series. Not really intentionally, but now I've got a whole year worth of stuff. And like, again, looking at some of my other favorites, Robert Frank or Alex Webb, like they're big photo book guys.
Yeah.
So now it's time to
that one right here.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just actually, as you were saying that, I was grabbing for this. This is another thing. The bigger books, not just the little flip book idea, but these bigger books for me, when I have a coherent, say, body of work or a theme or something I'm following or something like that, putting it down on paper for me is what gets me starting to realize what I actually captured. It's a lot different than, say, looking at it on a screen. When I can see it in paper and print like this, and I can share it with somebody. So I tend to do photo books of the street photography. I like to do that. And it's usually around a theme, but not always. Sometimes it's just a year's worth. I'll do a kind of a compilation of the ones that I really liked from a given period of time. But when you see them like that, I think it's a good exercise to edit down your work. Not everybody's good at that. And I practice it all the time.
Oh my God.
How do you know which ones of your own images you even like, right? Isn't it hard?
Yeah.
But I think it's a good exercise for people. And putting a book together, it forces you to do that. Does this look good next to this page or doesn't it? And why doesn't it? Maybe that's a topic for another time. Maybe we can cover it.
You could spend an entire show just talking about like, okay, how do you edit down to a body of work? How do you put a book together? I just went to the library and got Robert Frank's The Americans out again, for the millionth time. And I feel like I've got it pinned out in front of me like a frog on a dissection tray, trying desperately to find its kidneys. Like, how do you put a photo book together? Like, this is a high watermark, right, in terms of the photo book.
I
And I'm
enjoy
looking
doing
at
it.
sequence and the way that he puts images next to each other and then how they relate.
I enjoy doing it, but boy, it takes me a while, right? It takes me some time. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, maybe
like
that's a topic
it
for
can be
another
tough sometimes, right? Like you've got that, I love this picture. It doesn't fit with this body of work. I got to chuck it.
fit. Yeah, you got to kill your darlings, as they say. And maybe it's for another book, right? So then you put those aside, do a different book, maybe, right? Maybe it fits in the next one. That's not a bad idea.
But yeah, books are great for this kind of thing. For like, now you do it long enough, you start to stuff clumps together into bodies of work, even if it's not necessarily in the same time period. I've found that like this thing that I took 5 years ago fits with this thing that I shot last week. I can put those next to each other.
Sure. The other thing that I found is some themes or some kind of images that work together as a book. I needed one or two more things like that I really didn't have a decent shot of. So that spurred me on to go shoot more to get it.
Oh, cool. So that kind of motivated you to go out.
That happened to me a couple of times where it was a motivation to say, boy, I need something for this facing page because I really want to give this book as a gift to someone. And it took me some time before I actually got another shot that worked for it. So I used it as a motivator.
Yeah. A photo book, like printing out the photo book and getting the finished thing, can almost be like cashing in your poker chips at the end of the night. It's great that you won a bunch of stuff, but like when you cash out, like now you've actually got the thing.
You've got something to show for it, right? Right.
Yeah.
Instead of just a slideshow or instead of just a post somewhere, right?
Right. Or post on Facebook, or like my Instagram feed looks great, but man, I got to do something with these pictures.
Yeah. Yeah. The books for me are a good outlet. I also do just a lot of individual prints. Just because I want to see what I'm able to get in a print, and I want to frame it. Sometimes I'll give those as gifts to people too, but I like to see the physical item. I'm just that way.
You know what I do sometimes, and I guess it's sort of a precursor to a book, is I kind of keep a bit of a journal, and we'll make little 4x6 prints, and I'll even like to the point of, well, I'm going to crop this. I'll physically cut it up and paste it into the journal and make notes and stuff. But I've got like sort of a running tally of like, this is kind of the stuff that I'm working on.
I think street photography lends very well to photo journaling, right? You know, where else did you go that day? What was the shadow? What were the colors in the shadow on this particular scene? Or, you know, what was it that you thought of when you saw this scene in the first place? I think journaling with cutout photos and drawings, or however you would journal, is a great complement to street photography. Yeah, I think you got me my next project, Scott. Thanks very much. Now I just have to find a time.
And I just got like it's like part photo journal, part scrapbook. Like there's other stuff like just kind of pasted in there. Like here's this thing that I grabbed off the street, or a portion of the map from the city we were walking around that day, or whatever. Just little ephemera also kind of finds its way in there. A leaf that kind of looked cool or something.
Excellent. Good idea.
All right. Well, it's been fun. We've gone way over time. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Everybody. If there are no other questions, I could sit here and talk about street photography all night, but I'm not gonna. So
thanks for indulging us, folks. Appreciate it.
Yeah. It's been a great time. Next week, we will be, well, not next week. Next week, we've got the week off. But the week after that, it's time to start talking about fireworks. So join us for the next photo show. We are going to be talking about getting some great fireworks photos just in time for the 4th and summer fireworks. Until then, get out there, get into the street, take some pictures. Things are opening up. Festivals are coming back. Get out there and take pictures and let us know how it goes. Leave us comments, send us email, send us questions, ideas for future shows. All that stuff is always welcome. And
thanks, folks.
Thanks so much. Night.